Hi all, thank you for attending our investment group event, Communicating on Sustainability and ESG, the Corporate Perspective. We are joined today by Robert Nuttall, a partner at sustainability-focused management consultancy, Fortitude Partners. Robert spent over 15 years in communications before moving into strategic consultancy, and he brings unique insights, having worked on sustainability initiatives long before they became more mainstream, including M&S's Plan A strategy back in 2007. So Robert will be drawing upon this experience and providing best practice examples as we discuss the corporate approach to sustainability and ESG, key challenges and opportunities, and the impact on communications across stakeholder groups. Just a quick note on the format before we get going. The presentation will be broken into sections and we'll be taking questions at the end of these, but if there's anything burning, please use the chat function as we go. Myself and Colby will be keeping an eye on this and filtering questions through to Robert as we go through. And we'll be aiming to wrap up by sort of 6 p.m. at the latest. So hopefully we won't run over too much. Robert, thank you for joining us today. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Julie, and welcome everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me. We've called it mainstreaming sustainability because that is where we think sustainability is going, and I'll explain a little bit more later on. But firstly, just a bit of background, but perhaps more importantly, just drawing some lessons out even from 13 or 14 years ago when I was involved in setting up what became known as Plan A for Marks and Spencer's. A little bit of the history, because I think it is relevant, particularly relevant, some of it today. So the then chief executive, Stuart Rose, saw a film, read a book, The Inconvenient Truth, An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore. Some of you may have read it or seen the film. And that spurred him to thinking about trust and M&S. So here was a trusted brand, but his view was that it needed to have reasons to trust. And that was his definition 14 years ago of sustainability. He is was and is a hard-nosed retailer, not what you would typically have found then, certainly in the sustainability world. A huge lever for strengthening that trust with customers. So that was the backdrop. He then asked, as it happened, a bunch of senior managers to come with him to a cinema for the afternoon in the West End to view the film. No great stress there. But then it said at the end, okay, I want a plan. And we all looked at each other somewhat bemusedly and then went away. But before he went away, he said, oh, by the way, I want to launch it in 100 days. So there was a very interesting initial process as everybody sort of scrabbled around. But within that process, there were 100 targets over a 5-year plan. I think one of the lessons I would learn, which I think is particularly, I would cite, particularly relevant today, that this was an enormously uncomfortable experience for most people involved, just in case people think that because this area is sustainability, it should always be fun and great and exciting. It can be all of those things, but it can also be very unnerving when you're being pushed to make decisions, set targets, as we were then, and many organizations are now, where you really do not have an idea as to how you're going to achieve them, or little idea as to how you're going to achieve them. And I think that experience then is perhaps more relevant than ever today. So I think being unreasonable for a CEO is actually quite a good thing in this area. And for those of you that have worked in organizations or advised organizations that have experienced this, again, I think this is needed now actually more than ever, even though those at the receiving end might not always welcome it. I think the other thing, 100 days, it was launched within 100 days. So the whole plan launched 85 NGOs. There is something about urgency. Never mind the issues that the world faces that require urgent action. There is something about galvanizing an organization to move quickly, because one of the things this area is, I think, quite unique in is it does touch every part of the organization, and it's there is no point having one part of the organization moving quickly and the rest not. It simply doesn't work. So having that speed and focus is something, A, I experienced then, and B, I would say is particularly relevant today. And then the final element, which is well understood now, is employee engagement, which of course some of you may well be involved in your day jobs. This is an area then and certainly now where you do find employees will respond very, very rapidly, both in terms of helping embed it, in terms of innovating, and in terms of advocating for it. It is something which we think is enormously powerful in all sorts of ways, which I'll touch on a bit later. You can see a picture there of 600 of the Plan A champions that I had for the 85,000 person organisation, and they were my sort of eyes and ears to keep me on track. So just a few a few lessons from there. It has so far delivered, not that it's going to save the organisation necessarily, so far delivered about £750,000, and that's been independently audited. So it has delivered value, it's delivered reputation, it's certainly delivered very different ways of working, and that again was some time back. Even though you do meet some strange people on the way, as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, but we'll move on from there anyway. So moving on to the next slide. If there is another lesson I've learned from that, and it's been reinforced time and again since, is that one of the key lessons I've learned is connecting to what people really care about. In this area, in sustainability, you will often find, and you may have done it yourself, you communicate and indeed you set strategies which are about the big world. And then wonder why that hasn't sort of gelled, hasn't connected with customers, consumers, or indeed your employees. Because of course, to state the obvious, for the most part, most people care about themselves and their family, first and foremost, then their community, and then the big world. And yet often in terms of setting the strategy in this area and communicating, it starts the other way around, and still does. And you see a lot of that, particularly in the communication arena. So moving on from there. So that is why a bit of the backdrop in terms of Fortitude, we in this world of massive social and environmental disruption, this is the reason we've concluded that sustainable business is the #1 driver of value creation. I mean, it's that simple. It may not have been that obvious some years ago. It's becoming more and more obvious now. And as those of you in the investment community will know, it's also being understood increasingly by investors. So that is our point of view. The sort of companies we work with tend to be large corporates. They tend to be pretty advanced in this area. They've been doing it for a long time, but they'll be the first to admit that they're only sort of scratching the surface. There is so much more potential, both for value creation as well as impact. So moving on, I guess one has to just pause a minute and just sort of recognise, however, that the challenges that we, the world, organisations, individuals are facing are huge, and as I said earlier, they are urgent. We've just lifted out a few examples there, which do make you sort of pause for thought. I think. The history of man-made materials now likely outweighs all life on Earth. The weight of living biomass halved since the agricultural revolution. That's on the loss of habitats on the one side, growing inequality, the 22 richest men in the world, more wealth than all the women in Africa, the concentration of wealth, the 1% owned by 44%. This is not a healthy, not a healthy system. So, one could go and sink into a mass depression, a gloom, if you like, and thought, wow, this is just too much. And indeed, as again, many of you will have seen, a lot of the communication in this area is laying out the challenges and not always the solutions. So on the one hand, one has to recognize the scale of the challenges and just to re-emphasize the urgency, because this is the decade where many have said, and we would agree, that action has to take place. And this will put corporates under huge pressure. I think they have not yet really felt it yet, but will do in the next few years by way of responding, but also for those that respond with ambition and with foresight, they will also benefit. So the challenges are huge. I think many of us will recognize that, and many of them are not going away, and indeed in some cases getting worse. However, I think we should also be optimistic moving on that the solutions, are within reach. You will read many of them. They can range, from this huge industry that has developed around clean meat or meat alternatives, renewable energy, you will know, has increased dramatically as the prices have come down, which is very has surprised many commentators from even a few years back. You have a whole new thinking around circular economy. You've got whole new ideas around regenerative agriculture. The electric vehicle boom, is just getting started. I mean, it's going to ratchet up, but cause some challenges. The boom in ESG, which I'll come back to a bit later, which is moving on rapidly, and then you've got a lot of pension funds on the money side investing in net zero. So there are these and many others where we think there are reasons for optimism. Although we're not out of the woods yet by any stretch of the imagination. And of course, also, there is now huge mobilization across business, government, and individuals in all sorts of different dimensions. And both citizen activism, in terms of manifestos, in terms of roundtables, in terms of groups working together, including competitors working together. And this we are seeing really quite a sea change in how people view partnerships. Certainly when I was at M&S 13, 14 years ago, for example, working with NGOs was seen as a slightly iffy thing to do. I mean, you'd do it, but you'd be a little bit worried. And if you could avoid it, you might do. Now it's so mainstream to do that as an example of people broadening out their thinking, recognizing they can't do it alone, and working with other like-minded individuals, groups, businesses, governments, etc. So our conclusion, as I said at the beginning, is it is mainstream. It's here to stay. Again, you can see many examples from human rights issues. There's a picture of the tea plantation, obviously very powerful visuals, films that have demonstrated and shocked many people in terms of what is happening. Quite dramatic thinking by organizations. You see Danone talking about a food revolution, so the kind of language and the thinking is quite dramatic. And then the understanding of job creation, wealth creation that this shift to a net zero world can create, and that becoming sort of better understood, more accepted, not least that there will be major challenges in ensuring a just transition. But I think the overarching conclusion is that this is becoming more and more central, certainly for business, and both in terms of how the business will focus its own business model and adapt to these changes, but also how it will take advantage in an appropriate way to create value. And I think that is way better understood than it perhaps was even 2 or 3 years ago. So I'm going to sort of pause there a moment. This is just a bit of context if there's any questions, and if not, I'm happy to move on.
Yeah, just a reminder, please use the chat box if you have got any questions. Both myself and Kuldeep will keep an eye on that as we go along, and ask sort of where there's natural pauses like now, or equally if anything burning, we can ask as we go as well. I mean, I had just a very quick question actually, Robert, which was something that just came to me from the first slide, and we may well sort of come onto it, but it was quite, obviously for the first sort of big sustainability initiative from M&S, being such a massive company, and doing it in such a short time frame. I mean, how did you, or what was the scale of the challenge from, to your point, on engaging everyone who needed to be engaged in such a huge organisation? With all it's a good question. It was very focused, and I think again a lesson that's probably relevant to others. I think there were probably about 35 of us involved, of whom I would say at least 25 were subject experts, were technical experts, scientists, and there was one room, and it was come in, tell us what you're going to do in the next 5 years, and then the CEO would come in and say that's not good enough. To do something better and bigger and faster, and they go away and come back again, and it was an iterative process. So it was a sort of rapid engagement process of a relatively, at that point, limited number of people, supported at appropriate moments by external subject experts. But it was very science-based. It wasn't how we're going to communicate all of this. It's just what are we going to go and do. Got you. That makes sense. Okay, wonderful. Well, I'll mute myself, and just a reminder, any questions, use the chat box, and I'll let you carry on, Robert. Thank you.
Yeah, I had a quick question, Rob. You mentioned at the beginning that the whole process, it's quite a rapid process, and it's quite uncomfortable and unnerving to have those conversations. I wonder if you have any top tips in for our listeners here today, where they feel that their companies they can do actually a bit more around this, how to approach those conversations with those internal stakeholders and get that ball rolling where they can actually make serious change and be taken seriously on that sustainability front.
I think typically what we find, there are always very powerful advocates for this at a senior level in organisations, not necessarily where you expect to find them, and they may not have your version of sustainability, but they really want to make change. And we generally find, and the advice is, you find somebody at the top who wants to do this anyway. They are looking for supporters, they're looking for ideas, and they'll coalesce people around them to make it happen. It'll be imperfect. Often it won't be via committee. It might be early on, slightly anarchic, which we have seen. But those senior people, and there are always some, hopefully it's the chief executive, but it isn't always the chief executive, he or she will help push it through.
Thanks, Rob. We've just had a question come in from Claire asking, in the year of COP26, what do you think will be the new challenges for companies?
I'll touch on that a bit later, if I may. I do have a slide on COP26. So, but good question. So we could just pause that one.
Perfect. Great.
Sure. Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert.
So in terms of how organisations are, sort of internalising all of this, to use a much overused phrase, I mean, they are all on a journey, of course. So when I was talking about M&S all that time ago, I would say many organisations were on that left-hand side, sort of license to operate, if indeed they knew what that was at that point, meeting expectations. And doing a bit of giving back and doing good through philanthropic exercises was typically what you would find, run by two different groups, reporting randomly into different teams. So the overall impact is limited. But now you start, seeing it moving quite rapidly to the right. Obviously, the harmful activities primarily around the environmental piece initially, and some of that was driven by legislation, some of it driven by reputation, some of it was driven by saving money. So that has become a pretty de minimis standard. The whole world of transparency and reporting has also moved on. Huge demand now, and has been for some time, and that was the next sort of evolution as companies started reporting. I'll come back to that a bit later, because I think that's a whole area which is under a lot more scrutiny now than it was before. And then it starts to get kind of more interesting in terms of reducing risk and increasing efficiency. Okay, so that's the kind of mitigation piece, but also where the big cost savings come. Again, a lot of it was focused around the environmental piece, but increasingly now the social piece, particularly around areas like human rights. And then, of course, the final stage, I mean, it's sort of a continuum, is the organizations that have begun to understand this is a central model to creating value. So just on the next slide, essentially what you've got is this sort of upward curve, fairly straightforward in that regard. But the one thing I would say is this is not linear, is that companies leapfrog. And one of the things we often find is you get major disruption happening in the industry, you get major competitor activity, you get a new leadership team, or all of those things and others, which act as a spur for the organization to think very, very differently about this and move rapidly along this continuum. That is also one of the reasons why, certainly with those that we work with, always are very, very aware that, you never know what their competitors are thinking about. But what you can be pretty sure is that some of them will be thinking some pretty radical thoughts, and along the sort of moving on the spectrum very quickly. So that's a kind of bit of a flavour. And of course, as part of that, a much better understanding of that continuum. Let me go to the next slide, it's okay. As part of the, as they move along the continuum, there's much better understanding of what this whole area offers. So risk and cost, understood in the early days, I would say, still very important, of course, and can yield very substantial benefits and reduce risk. So one has to say, yeah, those are important. However, in terms of sort of value creation, a much clearer understanding that this area can create future resilience for the business, make the business actually a sustainable business in the years to come, can create huge trust and relevance amongst all stakeholders in a way which many other things cannot do, and indeed is expected of them. Often said, it's a major area of attracting talent. People will come to organisations that, frankly share their values, and that is expressed often through the sustainability strategies. So that's the most explicit view, and also increasingly, it's a massive driver of innovation. If you're thinking very differently about your business, very differently what you want to do in the business, how you wish to reach people, and this area provides a spur for some really innovative thinking, not least because they will see it frequently from new entrants coming into the market who are applying that thinking, and maybe competitors, maybe people they want to buy, but you see a huge amount of activity there. So the whole frame of reference has changed really quite dramatically, and particularly in those upward arrows, I would say. Moving on. So you'll all be aware of this, and I'm not going to dwell too long on it, but you'll all know of the SDGs. This is the kind of world's to-do list. This is the framework that the vast majority of organisations, certainly every organisation that we work for, uses. It was developed, as you know, with business, so it's not something which has been imposed by some international body. And nor is it legally binding, but it is a very helpful, robust framework for companies to use as their to-do list. So I'll come back to that a bit later, but it is hugely helpful to have that single framework. So in terms of how companies, I was saying earlier, in terms of actually how they're adapting and applying their sustainability strategies, you do see quite a sort of variation. So these are examples of companies where sustainability is central to their strategy, but they're applying it in very different ways. So you take an example like H&M on the left-hand side. So they're really looking to change the industry. I mean, you can see their call to actions, let's change fashion. They're almost undoing their own business model and advocating others to do the same. So really encouraging an industry-wide shift in a sector which is massively impactful, particularly on the environment, but also socially. Or you've got an idea like an approach like IKEA, focusing on a big issue or a solution, in this case around circular making, circular living, where they're looking to sort of break the traditional consumption model and demonstrate that through the way in which they sell their products. You've got another variation of that, which is where sustainability is the primary value driver. Now, Stora Enso, you might not know, it was initially forests. It grew forests. It's 800 years old, one of the oldest companies in the world in Finland. They now talk about themselves as a renewable materials company, and that is their business. And they've been doing it for literally many hundreds of years. An alternative is where, as I said earlier, sustainability can be a source of innovation. Nike is a good example. You could use Adidas as well, but their products demonstrate, innovative thinking and sustainable thinking as well. You've also got the frame of reference where sustainability is a guide to the future, such as BMW, where they are using sustainability to sort of vision ahead, or about, as they've got here, visionary mobility. What does that look like? And that is not just cars. That is an integrated view of individual mobility. And then at the other, perhaps the far end of the spectrum, is Unilever, where sustainability is the strategy. That is how they would describe it. So they have a purpose to make sustainable living commonplace, and then the three strands or the three areas of their strategy are brands with purpose grow, people with purpose thrive and companies with purpose last. And out of all of that comes their business priorities, comes their KPIs. They do not have a sustainability strategy. This is the strategy, and it is sustainability. So that is perhaps the more extreme example. Which is why we give this as one example in terms of what that delivers for the organization on the next slide, which is where you see, first of all, the current CEO, who's quite clearly convinced that this whole area is going to drive the business. But perhaps more importantly, just some of the deliverables. So there he was in January saying, okay, sustainable sourcing has delivered, has cut costs by $1.5 billion. So that's a reducing cost play. And then perhaps more exciting, they've been saying this for a while, by the way, that in terms of driving growth, there's sustainable living brands, that is those brands that make a definable and positive impact socially or environmentally, or both, have grown very considerably faster, 69% faster than the rest of the business, and delivered 75% of the growth. So that is why they arrived at this conclusion that sustainability is their strategy. It reduces costs, it drives growth, and delivers lots of other benefits as well. And as part of that, moving on, we're also seeing, in the context of these ambitious companies, these companies that understand value, these companies that understand the urgency, we're also seeing that targets are becoming hugely more ambitious. So Unilever set their target for hand washing. This was to meet one of the major health challenges for children. Most children, one of the biggest causes of death of children under 5 is through diarrhea, and that's through lack of sanitation and hand washing. So Unilever owns soap, make soap, so let's get involved in this on scale. So they set themselves a target of 1 billion people, and to reach 1 billion people, and I was involved in that some 10 years back. And it was, well, what number shall we pick? I mean, it's a huge problem, so we better have a huge target. There wasn't an idea how the organisation would get there, but only an idea. And it actually, as of I think last year, they exceeded it. A couple of years ago, they exceeded it, as you can see there from that from those results. But also there are other examples. Kingfisher setting a financial target in terms of sustainable product sales of 5 billion, and then targets around fully electric, net zero. Or the climate fund for Microsoft, who've also, as you know, looking to remove all their carbon that the company's emitted since 1975 by 2050. So they've got another carbon target, which is quite way beyond what others have done. But I think one of the things I'd observe here, this comes back to what I said at the beginning, is that these setting these types of targets for organizations, and if you're in one that's looking to set targets around this area, carbon or anything else, it is uncomfortable. You have to be quite courageous and take a view and think, okay, that's the right thing to do, and push on with it. So there is a kind of psychology attached to some of this. You can't get too scientific, although it does have to be rooted in solid science. So there's an interesting balance there about be realistic, but be really ambitious at the same time.
I know we're not a natural break, but could I just pick up on that, Robert, to your point on the being scientific point, and particularly around the targets with that, over 1 billion people, how do you measure that when it's those sorts of numbers?
So they worked with the UN. So they went to the UN, with whom they had a relationship with, and said, we're really good at reaching people, probably better than you, UN. Actually, we reach 2 billion people a day. So we reach a quarter of the world's the world's people. So we're great at that. We also understand how to market an idea. But what we need is verification. We need to make sure that this is having a positive impact. You're health experts. You understand that and how to help manage and deliver that. So they were actually almost in a supporting role, UN, in this instance. It wasn't, Unilever weren't tucked up under a UN program, which is typically the model. They actually were leading it because they had the capability and the scale and the reach, and the UN was supporting to ensure that it delivered. So it was quite a different model than had been done before.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I didn't really think about that, but playing to your strengths, they probably already do that. So yeah, fascinating.
Yeah. So moving on, there's a bit of a break here, or we can, if there are any questions, or I can move on. Just a few examples, just to kind of, again, just bring it alive about what other organizations are doing. I'm not trying to cite these as sort of best practice, they're just from different angles of where organizations have gone. So you've got Project Gigaton with Walmart, has been around for a while. So this is really working with the suppliers and with a view, as you can see in this in bold and writing, to avoid 1 billion metric tons, i.e. a gigaton of greenhouse gases, equivalent to taking 211 million cars off the road for a year. So quite a big ambition. Of course, they have huge supplier base. So the idea was to work in sort of collaboration. This is not the typical relationship necessarily with retailers who are just screwing down on the suppliers. It's actually in collaboration, giving them tools, giving them models, giving them frameworks to help make this happen. The sting in the tail, one has to say, is that obviously, suppliers that didn't play ball, they perhaps couldn't quite always rely on being a supplier to Walmart forever. But that wasn't a precondition. So that's still in motion. I think it'll hit the targets. We'll see, but it's an interesting example, we think. Because for so many organizations, so much of their impact is with their supply chain. So how do you engage them in something meaningful? Another example, a different kind of example, of movements. So you will have seen many of these. There's an example of L'Oreal, Patagonia, and in some cases this might be confronting their own business model, thinking, okay, we actually need to think about this fundamentally differently, and we're going to actually campaign for change. It might be, as you've got with L'Oreal, looking to address a real social issue, and a sensitive one as well, through a brand which has all sorts of potential pitfalls if you get it wrong, but also massive benefits if you get it right, given that you can reach so many people. Another example, this is on a much smaller scale, very UK focused, I know, but I think an interesting example, again, where you make a difficult choice, or potentially a difficult choice. So here is Timson's, you'll know they do shoe repairs, amongst other things, and they some years back, recognizing that 10 million people in the UK have a criminal conviction, decided they would hire ex-offenders, actively hire them and actively train them. So 10% of their workforce are now those who have criminal convictions. Not the sort of thing a typical boardroom would have a meeting about, when talking about, talent. So, one has to say this is a very, very interesting example, albeit a relatively small company, of how an organization just thought fundamentally differently about its role in society, what it could do to make a difference, and going down a difficult path, not an easy path, but it's been very successful. A different example, again, is working with communities, which companies are increasingly looking to do. So how can they help address a massive issue, which they are well aware of? So if you take Sainsbury's, the issue was around food waste. 7 million tons of food is thrown away in the UK every year, probably more than that now. And they wanted to do something about it in communities. So the approach, which was hugely successful and has continued, is to trial one idea, to trial different ways of doing this in one town, in this case, Wanacott in Derbyshire. And what they did is they essentially, before they awarded this to Wanacott, they went out to a whole load of cities and said, we're going to give you £1 million, the winner £1 million, you bid for what you would like to happen in your town, and demonstrate that you will support this trial. So there were a lot of cities pitched for this £1 million. Swanley won it, and this money was then used to basically test out all sorts of different ways that food waste could be addressed, but using the community, not top down. It was community bottom up, within the community. Let's observe, let's try, let's test. And on the back of that, then rolled out the approaches, the successful approaches of which they are listed there. The 4 sets of approaches. Let's roll it out more widely. So quite an interesting example of a corporate addressing an issue which they know a lot about, but the answer actually rests in large part within the communities, as well, of course, as the corporates like Sainsbury's, who are creating some of the problems themselves. And then looking at a Another example, this actually is quite interesting because this is just this week on Allbirds. They announced that they're going to make their carbon footprint calculator open source ahead of Earth Day, which is this week as well. And a full page, which you probably can't see on the other side, full page ad in the broadsheets. Quite nice there. It was a sort of fake email to the likes of Adidas, Burberry's, Ralph Lauren, Prada, Louis Vuitton saying, hey guys, there's a new calculator here, it's ours, please do use it. And this is definitely a trend we're seeing, early days yet, I think, of companies sort of open sourcing their knowledge and their expertise to others, even their competitors. Kering, the fashion brand, another example with what they call their EP&L tool, and that's a tool for measuring and quantifying the environmental impact of a company's activities, which they developed for themselves and then open source some years ago to the fashion industry. So that's all their competitors as well. So again, a very different approach to helping begin to solve possibly systemic issues within a sector. But what I would say is that it is very crowded out there, particularly around net zero. We quite like the quote there on the bottom left. Can any firms confirm they're not going carbon neutral? Will be a lot quicker. So they're all saying it, they're all talking about it. It's kind of now a date. It's a date gig. You know, is it 2030, 2045? Many companies are trying to work through how they bring their dates forward, but for some companies that does have major implications, financial implications. But increasingly, it's quite hard not to, because you do stand out, as being a laggard, particularly as some of your competitors are moving quickly in this area. So I think you'll see in the next 12 months in particular, and that's part of the outcome and the run up to COP26, is that there'll be huge amounts of pressure on companies, to demonstrate that they are serious about this. And then talking of COP26, I think it has still to be worked through exactly the format of this and who's actually going to come and whether it's going to happen in the way that's expected. But if it's anything as previous ones, I think this one will be different because I think you've got the Biden meeting, obviously this week with 40 world leaders. You've got our targets just announced this week for the UK. You've got quite a lot of activity in the run-up, which is going to set, we think, quite a high bar, both in what countries are going to need to sign up to, but most particularly what organisations are going to be needed to do. And we would expect, and this is as much a communications exercise from what we've seen so far, there's going to be plenty of announcements of companies who want to get a profile in the next few months prior to COP to demonstrate that they're on the case, they are leaders, they are serious, and hopefully get some credit. So it's going to be pretty crowded, I think, on the announcement front in the next few months.
I think there was a natural break there, wasn't there, if we want to
do
another shout out if there are any questions. As I say, please use the chat bar. There is another Q&A tab. Kuldeep, can you just check that there's not something separate on?
Yes, there's a question submitted here around greenwashing, and I guess that goes back to your point about setting targets, and to your point just now, with a lot more announcements coming out. How can businesses avoid greenwashing, purpose washing while making those announcements?
Oh, that's an excellent question, and I'll come back to that a bit later if I may. I do have some thoughts, and I have some examples, some great examples of greenwashing if you needed any more, but because they're still happening, which is quite sad. But we'll come to that later.
Great, thank you.
And I just wanted to pick up on one point, which seems like a theme that runs through a lot of those examples that you gave, which is this notion of thinking quite broadly about your stakeholder groups and how you engage with them. For example, thinking about the supply chain engagement, whether it's a specific community. So I just thought that was quite an interesting takeaway from this section. Is very much that looking outwards at all levels seems to sort of be a thing?
No, I think exactly right. Not least because often for organisations their impact is actually outside of their four walls, and in some cases it could be up to 90%. We have clients where 90% of their impact is outside their company. So obviously you kind of have to make any difference. For other organisations, depending on the sector you're in, it might be the reverse. You might be within your own four walls, and then you need to move. Then you need to really move fast because it's within your own control.
Yes.
So
yes, of course.
you've got no excuses. So moving on swiftly, just going to touch briefly on ESG. Again, I know from this group, a lot of you will be familiar with that and the issues around it. But it is a whole area which is, as you know, growing rapidly in importance, taking much more of a centre stage within corporates as they look to frame their sustainability strategies in ways that will meet the needs of their investors. So under the ESG, you'll of course know the environment piece covers the likes of greenhouse gas, biodiversity, water, renewable energy, social, the likes of human rights, diversity, health and safety, and income equality, and governance, broad composition, anti-corruption, remuneration, and tax strategy, to name but a few. So quite sort of broad based. It is still a relatively new kid on the block in terms of corporates. Even the language, and God, this is one area that does not need new language, has now finding its way into the organisation. But the reasons I think are quite obvious. Moving on to the next slide, you'll know some of the facts and figures. There are lots around, but the growth of sustainable and responsible funds growing, vastly. The likes of Larry Fink, who is often quoted, the chairman and chief executive of BlackRock, who's being extremely explicit about the role he sees sustainability playing, and writes, as you know, every year to CEOs of the companies they invest in, laying it out, and laying it out pretty strongly. So definitely we're at a sort of tipping point there. Again, moving on. And these are just some of the figures we put together, what we call upsize. These are sort of graphical representations of some of the big themes. You can find them on the web, but it does lay out, we think, quite nicely some of the kind of key facts that are happening and that one should be aware of. So there is a gap to deliver the SDGs in terms of what's required, and can that happen? Well, there is currently 379 trillion assets held by banks. Just that 1.1% would be enough to fill this SDG financing gap. So it is not beyond the realms of possibility that funding for this transition to a net zero world can happen. And as we said earlier, also, the economic benefits and social benefits of doing that are very, very significant, and seem to be so by the likes of WEF, who publish information on this very, very frequently. And as you'll also know on the next slide, in terms of the momentum increasing quite considerably, but I guess also, as we got here with the Apple example, increasing examples of senior management being held to account for the delivery of ESG performance. Nothing like focusing management, when money is attached to it. And then the likes of Mark Carney, who has often said, and restated that he does see this as the greatest commercial opportunity of our time. So he's describing it very much as a ex-governor of the Bank of England, but now very much involved in this whole area. And then the kind of whole momentum in terms of just the amount that's been invested. And I haven't mentioned COVID yet, but I mean, it's just extraordinary just how much was invested during the COVID period, which perhaps surprised some people, although there is a kind of logic to it, if one gives it some thought. So, and then in terms of performance on the next slide, you can see first of all, the value of assets tripling, doubling, and then tripling over the last 8 years, now standing at around 40 trillion. I mean, these figures move the whole time. The cost of capital being lower, and the overall performance outperforming the S&P 500. So there are lots of indicators that this has got legs, if you like, the whole ESG piece, which again, I'm sure some of you are very familiar with, but moving on at pace. what has this done? Like I said earlier, I mean, it has created an enormous sort of alphabet soup of terminology. So you've got a whole range of concepts. I mean, even we generally, with our clients, we sort of ask them, well, what do you call this? Do you call it sustainability? Do you call it responsibility? Do you call it corporate responsibility? Do you call it sustainability and responsibility? Is everywhere now, and there's if you're ever looking for terminology, it doesn't exist. Trust me. As in one thing, it was a case where sustainability meant environment and responsibility meant social, but I mean that's all gone. So now it's pretty mixed up language. Lots of different frameworks, many of which are being developed, some of which are in place, but which are the dominant ones I think is being worked through, and then the ratings indices, which again will be using different algorithms. All of this is taking a lot of time up for organisations to work through. Which frameworks they should be applying, which ratings agencies they should work with, how they describe all of this to colleagues and other stakeholders. It is quite confusing from a comms perspective, let alone anything else. And I think the other thing, this may send you to sleep straight away, but the annual reports and how these are shifting quite dramatically. So not only is sustainability much more central in annual reports, you'll see lots of examples of that, but the way in which annual reports now describe sustainability as a core element of business is very different. So the BASF example, if you ever had the time to go online, just really interesting, highly interactive. You can see exactly how sustainability elements fit into the business model and the results of that. Also, interestingly, from a comms perspective, they explicitly say that annual report, the way they've designed it and communicated it, is for citizens. It's not just for investors. So very much more accessible. You have a chief exec down there speaking about the strategy, of which at least half of it is around sustainability for the 4 minutes he talks. On the other hand, you've got the likes of Adidas, who've got these almost kind of brash positioning of sustainability and their annual report and annual results in a way which is very, very different to what you might have expected. So I think what we see, therefore, from a comms perspective, you've got some quite interesting examples happening out there, and more of them, where annual reports are becoming a vehicle for communicating to all stakeholders, and where sustainability as the non-financial element is taking a center stage. Not that we ever do annual reports, but for those of you that are or involved in them, quite big changes afoot there, we think. This came out this week, and I just wanted to mention it because we found it really fascinating anyway from Harvard Business Review, saying in spite of this huge increase in reporting, and this is using the GRI's initiative standards, which are very common. So vast increase in reporting, has actually had any impact on what is happening. In this case, global CO2 emissions are still going up. So what is the reporting doing? Is it confusing output with impact? And you can see their sort of summary. And certainly this causes a question, we think, for us, at least on corporate responsibility reports. I'm sure if you work for an organization, you've probably got one. There is, I think, a bit of a question emerging as to the value. Now, of course, there's a value in reporting. You can't say you should never report, not at all. But often, as they cite here, the content, it's quite hard to compare like. Often it's not independently audited. And yet there is a massive industry of CR reporting, which has been around forever. I mean, any large corporate will have their CR report, typically, an 80, 90 pager, with pictures, with stories, with facts, with figures. And there is a bit of a question, sort of elephant in the room. So what actually is it there for from a communication standpoint? And does it do the job? And I think there are definitely signs that there needs to be quite significant shift. I mean, again, as more sustainability moves more mainstream and becomes core strategy and is described as such within the annual reports, that I think will start to change the sort of balance. But to the question that came a bit earlier, we think there's going to be a huge pressure on greater transparency. Again, there does need to be some common standards, which themselves are in movement at the moment, in flux. But once it settles down, we think there's going to be in the next 2 or 3 years really quite a significant demand for much greater transparency from organisations. So moving on now to the.
Yeah, I was going to say, Robert, there was a question that came in that
sure.
probably covered, but I'll just read it out in case you had anything to add, which was where does the concept of integrated reporting fit into this? Do you see this picking up momentum? And is this best seen in the context of ESG? So I think we've probably covered most of that.
Yes, no, I think it does. Yeah, it does. No, I mean, that's definitely the sort of direction. And, you know, you will have seen we've done work for clients where we've looked at how different companies do that. Sometimes it's not, you know, not as integrated as it might be. I mean, it's in the same report. Other times it properly is integrated, and you can see how the sustainability strategy fits in. So yeah, it's all part of the same trend.
Thanks.
So just to finish off on a sort of lighter note, you are, as the question was earlier, there are still, you know, a lot of examples of what we call the green cliche. So as communications professionals, I'm sure you won't fall into the traps, but many do, of using, you know, sort of green signaling, be it color, style, type, which really all blur sort of one into the other. For some reason that we sometimes wonder, you know, people kind of revert to a type the moment it comes into this subject matter, and it's so ineffective. It really just does not stand out, even from those that might know better, and including on the next slide some of the claims that are being made. So we found this one quite interesting on the right-hand side. There was only I think it's a few weeks ago, so it's a very, very recent one. Now, you know, we're all for corporates working with WWF. What we sort of struggled a bit with this one is to understand. I mean, I hope I'm not offending anybody on the phone on the line who works for Carlsberg, but we would understand if they were promoting or, you know, agriculture, regenerative agriculture, or biodiversity. You know, I mean, they use the land. They don't, as far as we know, use the sea for their product. So it's a kind of, it's just not a, you know, how is this aligned to their core product? So it's not greenwashing, it's just relevance, I think. Others on the left-hand side is like, do you really think a battery is carbon neutral? I mean, is that honestly believable, or, you know, like really clean diesel from VW? You know, is that a real thing? So there is still, we think, a lot of challenges in this area, and part of it, and again, I don't want to offend those on the call, but in my experience, and I count myself as one of these, if you've been in the communication arena a long time, you probably gave up science quite early on at school. It wasn't necessarily always your thing. You may have carried on and done it at university. In my experience, you know, you're happy with kind of concepts, you're happy with visuals, you're happy with creativity. Do you really want to get deep into science-based targets around carbon abatement? You know, probably not. But you need to understand the people who do that, and you need to ask the right questions to understand what it is the organization is doing, and how you can describe that in a way that you can verify. I think it's those touch points that often still, unfortunately, are missing, of a sort of mutual understanding of what each party needs to know. But certainly for the communications professionals, having really, you know, robust conversations to ensure that you know, what you're saying can be proved and scientifically proved if that's the requirement, and that is something sometimes where you get missteps, as you can see here. So I'm on to the final slide. You'll be glad to hear. So I think my final thoughts on this really, firstly, just 4 thoughts. So the pressure is on. I mean, I say the race towards net zero. That's one of the elements, clearly, where there is definitely a race. But we expect organisations, if they're not already, you know, on this and setting their sustainability strategies going forward, working through how that is part of their, you know, core business, then we think either they will lose out on major opportunities, or they'll be called out, or both. As I said at the very outset, when looking to frame what you're doing, or those of your clients, it's really thinking about what those target stakeholders, it could be consumers, it could be customers, it could be investors, what do they actually care about? They are very unlikely to say they care about sustainability. That's a minority, but they might care about clean air, they might care about clean water, they might care about, you know, all sorts of areas, human rights, areas that are important to them. Transparency will be demanded. It's not going to be a sort of nice to have, and the transparency itself will have to be very, very transparent, with no room to hide. And then I think more broadly, as you're all communications professionals, you really are ideally positioned. And we do see this very often, that you can join what I've called join the sustainability dots, because you interact with the C-suite, you interact with sustainability teams, comms teams, marketing, IR, to name but a few. You're in a very unusual position to help sort of harness the thinking, the energy, the direction, and the way it's framed in a way which there's no other group really that can do it. And we often work with all of these groups, and it's the comms guys that kind of get how to link it all up. They're sort of almost like a second, it's just natural for them because of the way in which they work across the organisation. So I would say, there's a major role to play. And my final slide is Happy Earth Week, which you may know is happening. I think it's actually happening today or this week. So if you want to get involved, it's happening now. So with that, if there's any questions, happy to take any questions. And we've got I think 2 or 3 minutes left.
Got a couple of minutes. I think there've been a couple on the chat. I can read the one out on the chat, and then Kuldip, do you mind checking the Q&A box as well? But on the chat, it's a point here on, you touched on COVID, given that most companies have suffered huge losses. Do you think this will challenge budgets to pursue ESG initiatives in a meaningful way over the next few years? It'd be interesting, Robert, to hear, obviously, given what you do, how you're seeing, if you're seeing any impact on budgets from corporates you're working with. I'd
actually say it's the reverse, because if one thing has happened, it's to demonstrate how fragile the earth is, and you can't make direct comparisons. I think that would probably not be right. But if you want to understand, as clients that we've spoken to have said, the narrative of the COVID at the very beginning, and it has been horrendous for many people, but the narrative was always there is a solution. There will be a vaccine, there will be vaccines at the end of it. It's come a lot faster than expected. What we're talking about is irreversible. And you imagine a world, and companies understand this, you imagine a world where we're having a conversation about COVID for which there was no solution. Think about that, and then think about actually the challenges that we're facing, or the world is facing. It is a crisis, and if it tips over, it's irreversible. It can't be sorted out. And I think that is much better understood now, and is what's driving, governments as well, including the UK government, is driving much more radical action. And if anything, COVID has just kind of triggered a thought going, oh my God, imagine this like forever, but kind of worse. I think has played. So no, it hasn't. And also, certainly with clients that we've had, the whole kind of caring for employees, caring for suppliers, caring for those that you work with, making sure they're safe, reaching out, has been second nature to many companies who've responded magnificently. So that is the same kind of thing that we're talking about, the same sort of mindset, if you like.
Perfect, that's really helpful. Was there anything, I'm conscious of time, but were there any final questions on the other?
Yeah, there was one question here, and it's in relation to other growing business trends. The question says, how do we reconcile some of this with fashionable growing business trends such as blockchain technologies?
Well, blockchain, we've certainly, back to transparency. It's early days yet, so I can't say that this is kind of, there's a lot of talk, let's put it this way, but certainly blockchain, for example, being used for transparent supply chains. And so you do see some examples of that happening now, and we would expect that to grow, to grow quite rapidly. I think one of the challenges is actually not a technological one, it's a psychological one, is that if you're further down the supply chain, do you really want to reveal your hand when your whole experience has been sort of sat upon by those sitting above you to push your prices down? Do you really want to be transparent in that regard? But notwithstanding that, there are emerging examples of the power of the likes of blockchain for transparency.
Oh, we've just had one more question come in. I'll just read it out. It says, being responsible about communications, how do you avoid jumping from one initiative to another and deciding on which initiative makes sense? The example that they've given is not having a statement on diversity when something shocking as George Floyd happens.
I think it's a good question. I mean, we do see organisations that sometimes do sort of bounce around a bit. But I think what is, you know what your business priorities are as an organisation. I'm sure as communications professionals, you'll also know hopefully your strategic priorities and how sustainability in its various guises sort of fits into that. And generally, it should be possible to filter those areas that are going to have the greatest impact. That could be negative in terms of reputational, that could be positive, it could be also value. But I think that is one of the things that certainly we do, a lot of others do, a lot of organisations do focus on is how to filter, because as you say, what you don't want is just tons of initiatives going on and giving equal weight to all of them. It just doesn't work.
Great, thank you.
Is there anything further, Kuldeep? Or
that's everything from the Q&A.
Wonderful, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining, and a huge thank you, Robert, for taking the time to talk us through all of those wonderful examples and your thoughts on where we're at. So yeah, thank you, and we'll keep you posted on the next session, which will be probably along a similar theme, because I think we've had a lot of interest in it. So
very good. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Have a good evening.